But let's see here. I do want to share. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Mindy Buchanan. I'm the Director of Patient Programs at the Foundation for Sarcoidosis Research. This webinar is Navigating the Holidays with Sarcoidosis. And I do want to very quickly share a big thank you to our sponsors, Mallinckrodt Pharmaceuticals, for their continued support of our awareness efforts and our education and wellness programming throughout the year. So thank you to Mallinckrodt. And I'm going to also go over a bit of housekeeping. So this is a webinar. We will not be able to see or hear audience members. This means that if you raise your hand using the raise hand function, we're not able to respond directly. However, the chat feature works only as a direct message to speakers and moderators. So feel free to use this if you'd like to chat directly to us. I will be able to chat with you all in the audience, and that's where I'll put any links discussed during the webinar. This session will also send out the links in the post-event email. You may also submit your questions through the Q&A function. You have the option of submitting this anonymously if you'd prefer. Again, the chat is automatically anonymous because only myself and Sandra here see it. And if you have any technical difficulties, please chat me directly and I'll do what I can to help. It's now my pleasure to introduce our expert for today's webinar, Sandra Manley-Eichler. Sandra is a behavioral health integration clinician with Linden Oaks Medical Group in the western suburbs of Chicago. She holds her undergraduate degree in psychology from Loyola University in Chicago and a master's of science in social work from Columbia University with a minor in law. Sandra started working with cancer survivors in 2012, first working as a program manager at Wellness Place, a community-based support center. She worked as an oncology social worker at the Robert H. Lurie Comprehensive Cancer Center at Northwestern Medicine, specializing in treatment of young adults with cancer until 2020, when she transitioned to working full-time as a therapist in a family medicine practice. In her practice, she treats a variety of mental health ailments, including but not limited to depression, anxiety, trauma, and adjustment issues related to chronic illnesses. With that, I will hand it over to Sandra. Welcome.
Wonderful. Thank you. And Mindy, would you do me a favor and help to share our slides for today? Thank you. And yes, please do use the question and answer, the chat. A lot of the presentation is primarily oriented towards group participation. So the only way that I'm going to be able to sort of keep the conversation lively is if you ask questions or if you make comments even. We'll have a little bit of time at the end to do some question and answer based on some of the comments or some of the questions that you had submitted with the Eventbrite when you signed up for this particular webinar. So I'd really love to be able to just make sure that we use this time for you. You're the one spending time with me on a weekend. If you're like me, I'm in the Midwest and it is a very cold, snowy day. And here we are talking about something that's incredibly stressful. And so I really want to make sure that I give you specific individualized time if I can. That being said, we do want to maintain some privacy. So for example, if you're, when we talk about the holidays, oftentimes we're talking about family members, no names. And I think that's pretty much the only thing that we'd be looking for. You could say a relative of mine or sibling, parent, whomever, just make sure that we keep that private so that we're not exposing anybody who doesn't want to be being identified. Mindy, could you grab the next slide, please? Thank you. Hey, that's me. Familiar person, right? So like Mindy was saying in my introduction, I am a licensed clinical social worker. I absolutely love the job that I do, and I've loved all the work that I've done over the last 10 or so years. Primarily, I got my start in oncology, but right now I'm working in, like she was saying, a family medicine practice. And so I have two roles. I get to be both a therapist as well as a therapist matchmaker. So I take in what patients are sort of looking for in terms of a specific mental health need, and then I connect them with somebody in my community. So throughout the conversations and maybe even the question answers at the end of the presentation, if you have questions about a specific type of therapy for a particular issue that you're struggling with, I might be able to sort of guide you of what to look for. Hopefully that could be something in addition to what we're talking about today that I can help with. My focus with my patients in my clinic primarily focuses on three places. So we're looking at how do we remove barriers to care? I'm a social worker by trade. I really want to make sure that I focus on helping people navigate financial issues, family issues, transportation issues, something that's going to make it harder for them to see a therapist. I fear for me, that's just a very practical approach to therapy. I can't really effectively help somebody with their mental health if they can't get to the therapy in the first place, right? So that's kind of the foundation that I work upon. And then when we're talking about The actual kind of therapy that I do, I focus specifically on the cognitive behavioral model of psychotherapy. So that means interacting between our thoughts, feelings, and our behaviors, and then integrating elements of positive psychology. And you'll see that in some of the slides that I have. Next, please. So I just wanted to do a quick overview of some of the topics that we'll be talking about. I really wanted to start off talking about what the holidays mean to you, because when we're talking about navigating holiday stress and navigating things like, how do I regulate my emotions? How do I say no? How do I make sure that I make the most of the holidays? We really need to start with a conversation about what the holidays mean to you. So if you're somebody for whom the holidays mean getting lots of presents, you're going to react very differently to family stressors than you would if the holidays mean quality time with family, or if it means something more from a spiritual, religious perspective. And we want to make sure that throughout the course of what I'm talking about today, that we focus on helping you address those particular values that you have as an individual person for the holidays. So the way that you celebrate the holidays is going to be perhaps different from the way that I celebrate the holidays. But the goal is not for me to have you see my point of view with the holidays. The thing that we're trying to address here is what tools can we use to make sure that you get the most out of the holidays in the way that it makes sense to you. So that's kind of where we're going to get started. Then we're going to talk about how to establish boundaries. And this is something I've covered for the Foundation for Sarcoidosis research before. And it's something that I think just deserves repetition, because boundaries mean so much in terms of being able to help us say no, being able to say yes to the things that we do want, and just figuring out, how do I even do that? And what does a boundary mean? I'm going to be implementing something called DBT, so helping you guys learn a little bit more about a skill-based therapy, and then an introduction to savoring, which is a positive psychology concept that can be used in your everyday life, not just in the holidays. Next, please. So what is the value of the holiday that you are thinking about? So we've got Thanksgiving next week. We've got a couple of other holidays coming up in December. We have to think about, what does the actual holiday mean to you, and how are you able to participate fully in the way that makes sense for you? So can we celebrate the holiday on a day that is not the actual holiday if I am not feeling well? Or is the actual day of the celebration more important? So for some people, it's a matter of, depending on how I'm feeling on that particular day of the holiday, I can just switch it. For example, for Thanksgiving, I know a lot of people who, even without managing a chronic illness, they just celebrate early so they can get cheaper flights, and so that it's easier to coordinate travel. Same with, other holidays that come out. But sometimes, depending on if the holiday has specific religious meaning to you, it's not something you want to defer. But that's just sort of a basic question for you to get started thinking about if you're trying to think about the holiday in question for which you're trying to sort of manage your stress. Is it necessary that I participate in person? And do I value the judgment of others over my own comfort? So maybe this is something, again, depending on what the actual holiday is, where you're thinking, you know what, I really do want to come in person. That's something that's really valuable to me. But maybe I don't. And maybe I would feel more comfortable still participating on the day, but maybe I want to do it via Zoom. I want to do it virtually, either because you're concerned because, COVID is still an issue. This is something we've been presenting about. And even though a lot of people have sort of, remarked that, COVID is over, it really isn't, right? There's still a lot of things that people are concerned about in the way of contagion. And so comfort level could not only be because of, let's say, sarcoidosis flare, soreness, fatigue. It could also be simply because of transmission and risk and what that looks like. And for a lot of people, they sort of settle and they decide they have to participate in person, and they can't advocate for their desire to do virtual holiday celebrations because they are valuing the judgment of others over their own comfort. Well, if I don't participate in person, my mom's going to be really sad. Or if I don't come in person, my sister-in-law is going to be really disappointed or judge me, right? So they're going to make me feel guilty. And when we look at something like this, we want to think about, do I value that judgment from the other people over my own comfort? Then some very practical things. Again, sort of a foundational part of the social work that I do is looking at practical barriers. So, if, let's say, the family is trying to invite you to fly across the country, but you are financially strapped, maybe that's just not feasible, right? Again, something like bringing gifts to a certain holiday, or feeling like I need to delve into further credit card debt in order to meet a certain expectation of gift giving. What is the long-term consequence of that money spent? So, for example, if it's something that the long-term consequence feels like it's okay, and it's something that you can manage, maybe that's not as much of an issue. But if it's something that long-term, that consequence of that money spent for that particular holiday, whether it's a family celebration or whether it's even from a distance sending really expensive gifts, what is the long-term consequence for you? Is that also putting value for others over your own comfort? And in this case, it's more financial comfort than physical comfort. What is my body capable of handling? Is time more important with others, or is the quality time more important with others? When I'm not feeling good, and if it isn't necessarily just the holidays, but maybe I have a gathering with a close friend of mine that maybe I've been planning for several weeks, and maybe my body's just not up to it, right? And I have to really think in that moment, am I going to be my full version of myself when I engage with this person? Or is this going to be challenged because I'm arriving to a situation, I'm trying my best to pull through, but I'm not really fully present because something that's going on with my body is preventing me from being able to be my full self? So how do we define quality time with others? How do we define what our time actually looks like when we spend that time with people over the holiday? Next, please. And so, given just that sort of overview, looking at the value of the holidays, what we're hoping to get out of it, what do the holidays mean to you? If you could just write in the chat box to Mindy and myself, I'd love to see what you have to say. And I'll repeat them since we're recording too. I know for me, one of the things that I love about the holidays is being able to see the children in our family spend a lot of time together. I have a young son, he's about 3 years old, and I have lots of other families who have kiddos. And so whether it's from a distance or whether it's actually in person, I love seeing the kids get excited about the holidays. So Mindy, I'm not getting any chats, are you?
No, I don't have any. I don't see any chats from folks.
Oh, here we go.
There we go.
I had to give you guys some time to type. That was my lack of patience. Spending time with kids and grandkids, quality family time and giving to others. I love all of these. And so these are things that, maybe if you want to write it on a Post-it, or you want to, sometimes it's kind of fun to have little reminders on your phone, maybe, or something that you see regularly, something to remind you whenever you're having conversations with family about what this planning looks like, to remind yourself that these are the things that you value most. And again, depending on the type of holiday that it is, then maybe that quality times is going to mean deferring the holiday to another time when you're feeling better, or it will be doing something more virtual, because quality time and spending time with people, even though it looks different in person versus virtually, that doesn't mean that we can't make connections with them, right? And this is also going to be helpful when we talk about scripting with boundaries, about clarifying the kinds of values that you have when you're trying to set limits with other people. You're bringing it back to, this actually isn't about guilt. It's not about a particular commitment or a party or something like that. It's everything that you've all listed. So I'll go through it again. So spending time with kids and grandkids, quality family time and giving to others. Are you guys noticing a pattern here? I love this too, intergenerational gathering now that the kids are young adults. So what a wonderful way to see family connecting and learning about what are the things that the older generations can impart on the younger ones, and vice versa. I don't know about you guys, but I feel like I learn almost more from people who are younger than me than from people who are my peers or my contemporaries. Same thing for people who are older than me, who lived at a time much earlier. Making memories is a really good one. So this is something that I think when we think about what does making that memory look like. And I work with a lot of patients who have been struggling financially for various reasons. First, COVID really hit the market very differently. A lot of people lost jobs when particular industries were hit very hard by the pandemic. Now, when we have inflation and some other economic issues, layoffs, things like that, people often feel that the holidays are about money. It's about what is the most expensive gift that I can get, or how do I sort of keep up with maybe what I've had to do in the past, or not had to do, but what have I typically done? Maybe I'm used to giving the grandkids 10 presents each, something like that. Making memories doesn't require that. Making memories is not something that costs money unless it involves travel, right? And even then we can still try to tap into all of these things, having quality family time, making intergenerational connections, and all of that without necessarily just focusing on the financial piece of it. So thank you very much for participating. We'll have some more opportunities for you guys to chat and participate. I love this one. So somebody said virtual would be great, but my family wouldn't go for it. And lots of frowning emojis, prayer hands, as well as purple hearts. This is going to be really important because we're going to tap into what is it that other people are trying to communicate? What are they telling you that they value by not allowing a virtual opportunity to gather, right? What is the message that they're trying to communicate, and what is the message that you're trying to communicate? And for all the people here, because we're talking about our values and the things that mean a lot to us, you are trying to communicate all of those wonderful things we just talked about, making memories, having time together in a way that feels safe. But what are the family members trying to communicate by not allowing a virtual session? And I would invite you to sort of think about, how do we ask that? And that's going to, again, come up when you talk more about boundaries, et cetera. So I'm going to close the chat for now. If we could go to the next slide, please, Mindy. So let's talk a little bit about what are boundaries. So I think when people see boundaries and they hear about it, we think about exclusion. We think about people limiting themselves from our presence. And boundaries is actually not about putting up a wall. It's not about limiting communication. It's actually about expanding communication, inviting people deeper into our lives. And so it gives us an opportunity to clarify our expectations and what our comfort level is with any given situation. And so when we think about boundaries, as you continue, both with this webinar and even after, to think about, how do I better communicate my expectations based on the values that I just talked about? Next slide. So I love this cartoon. Connie Sun is an incredible cartoonist. If you can see the cartoon here, it says, there's a picture of a woman who is drawing a circle around herself, and it says, I like drawing boundaries. And then in the next slide, you see a square, see? And then the bottom one, you see, I'm good at it. And yeah, it's another shape that she's drawn around herself. That's something that is really interesting about what boundaries are and what is difficult about setting boundaries with other people, or again, clarifying our expectations. So verbalizing what our expectations are, or saying what it is that we want, maybe isn't the actual worst part about that process. For example, one of the people who was commenting about how the family is not interested in virtual holiday gatherings, that person is probably able to very eloquently identify to this person's family about how they really prefer virtual connections. Hey, with everything going on with my sarcoidosis, with everything going on with COVID-19 still, I would feel more comfortable if our future holiday gatherings were done virtually. Wow, that wasn't so hard. What is it about all of this boundary business? But it's actually, the hardest part is not verbalizing what we want. It's how do we manage the consequences of those boundaries and the reactions of other people to it. So we can feel guilty. We are scared that other people will perceive us as cold or mean by setting those expectations. And, it's interesting because we want to find a way to make it easier for us to clarify our expectations without feeling bad about it. And recognizing that this is actually something that we want to not only do for ourselves, but we want to invite that of the people in our lives as well. So, for example, part of overcoming some of the guilt and all of that is to recognize that this isn't about exclusion, right? And this is about making room for the fullest version of ourselves when we preserve our energy and we maintain our dignity, right? And somebody had put in the comments about how a lot of the boundaries and things like that, both the consequences of other people and our reaction to them, and then setting the boundaries in the first place, is about keeping the peace, right? I don't want to stir anything up, so I'm just not going to say anything about what my expectations are. But then you still lose at the end of that, right? You feel more pressure to overextend yourself. You feel like you have less of that energy. And then when you have less of that energy, you can't be your fullest self. So not only do you not get to enjoy the holiday, but the people in your family don't get to enjoy the best version of you, right? So it isn't just the drawing of the boundaries itself. It's about how do we react to the people who are reacting to our boundary setting in the first place. Next slide, please. So how do I do it, right? Scripting is key. So that's something that I wanted it to be in all caps, because I think scripting is something that for patients who suffer from anxiety and people who are struggling with, what do I say? How do I communicate this? You rehearse, right? So actors, broadcasters, people like that, they rehearse what kinds of things they are going to say when they are presenting themselves, when they're performing, when they are reporting, etc. And when you have something that's very important to you that you want to communicate to other people, you have to have a script, or at least some general idea of what you're going to say. So my hope is that together we can all help each other find some better scripting. The first part actually isn't really necessarily part of a scripting thing, although I'm sure you'd have to find some of it if people are offering. So the first thing for holidays in general is, let's say you're not doing anything virtual, but you are meeting people in person. If possible, no carpooling, no sharing necessarily how you're traveling, because then you have an exit strategy to travel or leave separately if you're feeling so fatigued and you know that you can't spend a lot of time there. The other thing that I often recommend is setting those limits for your time, or really anything whenever possible. I'm not eating a lot these days, so I just want you to know and not be offended if I'm not taking too much to eat at dinner. My appetite's really been compromised, right? Or I'm not going to be able to get up and play football at Thanksgiving like I usually would, because I've been having a lot of soreness. So for the most part, at this upcoming gathering, I'm going to be sitting for a long time. And the one that I put here is, I'm noticing I can only spend a short amount of time socializing these days, so I can only attend the party for an hour or a half hour, or I can just stop in for a few minutes. When we do this ahead of time, as much ahead of time as possible, there's also time for the people who, if they're going to react negatively to you setting that boundary, they have time to kind of get over it, right? If it's something that's very abrupt, then there might be a little more of that tension and more conflict between you and the person with whom you're trying to establish that boundary. If you already have some predictable guilt trippers in your family, people who are going to try to guilt you for doing something or not doing something, don't just let it go or give in, right? Ask yourself, am I really doing something wrong? So if I'm communicating that I'm feeling too sick to be able to fully participate in a holiday activity, or I can't stay for as long, or there's something very specific that's limiting you, are you really doing something wrong, or are you just trying to feel better, right? So really recognize what's happening there. And when you're communicating to the other person, make sure that rather than addressing what the person is doing first, make sure you address your emotion first. So when we start our sentences by saying, you just always keep guilting me about this, why can't you understand what's going on with my illness? Or why can't you be more flexible or more sensitive? You're really attacking the other person, and it typically prompts defensiveness. Whereas if we start with the emotion first, I gotta say, I feel so defeated when you try to guilt me into coming to these holiday events. Then it's not about the holiday, it's about you feeling defeated. Or I feel disinclined to see you more often. which isn't technically an emotion, but I think it's communicating a consequence of what happens if the person keeps repeating the behavior. So emotion first language whenever possible. Trying to identify specifically how you're feeling first, and then addressing that person's behavior later. Okay, next slide, please. So this is why I love the Foundation for Sarcoidosis research, because, and I say it's your new bestie, but it probably already is if you're already participating in this webinar. But one of the things that I love about the Make It Visible campaign, and there's a link within the slides here if you want to check it out, it's also on the front page of the website, is when you involve other people in your advocacy efforts and you galvanize them to sort of evangelize the thing that you're trying to show other people about sarcoidosis and the symptoms and how invisible of a disease it is. It kind of makes you think you might get a little bit less pushback, especially if you were inviting them to also be campaigning. It would provoke a lot of cognitive dissonance, which is sort of the experience when we have two conflicting thoughts or feelings that are both kind of simultaneously true at the same time. And so if I'm on the one hand really helping my sister, my cousin, my husband, my mother, whoever it is in my family who has sarcoidosis, and I'm trying to raise awareness for the invisibility of the disease and the typical kinds of symptoms that people suffer from and what to do to be better knowledgeable about it. But then I go on the other end and I'm making them feel guilty for not joining me in an upcoming holiday activity or not being flexible with virtual gatherings. That doesn't really sit well, right? And so it works two ways. Both you're trying to sort of raise awareness for the disease and how people can be better helped. And I think in general, just raising awareness of the disease in general. I think that in general, social media has helped a lot, but we've got a long way to go, right? So the more the merrier. But then it's, again, another way that it can help us to establish those boundaries, because people see the science behind it and they see the other people who are suffering from sarcoidosis. It's not just a family member who's saying no to them or who's suggesting an alternative when they're setting those boundaries. Next slide, please. So the other thing too is when we're managing a chronic illness, I've noticed for so many of my patients is that the feeling of guilt typically seems to be something that people feel very internally. But many times the guilt is actually not because they did something wrong, but rather because an illness that they cannot control, cancer, sarcoidosis, diabetes, etc., is preventing them from doing a particular action. It's not because you specifically as a person knew that something was wrong, but you decided to do it anyway. It's because you can't help it. You have an illness, and that's what's preventing you from being more energetic, from being able to participate in certain things. It's not actually your fault, right? And so I want, with the scripting and with your language, to try to distance your reactions from the actual illness, right? So instead of, I feel so guilty for canceling, I wish I was feeling more energetic. I'm so sorry, Aunt May. That's from Spider-Man, because I've been feeling so sore lately and I just can't participate with blah, blah, blah. Why are you feeling guilty when you didn't do anything wrong? So we're not apologizing. We're not going down the guilty road. We're going to talk about the sarcoidosis. Man, sarcoidosis is such a bummer. It's really getting in the way of my fun here. And I'm really looking for, and we can swivel it too, right? So we can also say, I'm looking forward to meeting at a different time when my symptoms aren't so bad. So you can still also end on a more optimistic note. So what do you see as the difference between these two responses? And you can feel free to type it in the chat. I'm also getting a comment from somebody else that when they're trying to set boundaries with other people, especially about their symptoms, that they're shown as complaining. And here's what's so interesting is when I think about complaining, because people will say, I have patients who come in and they go, oh, I'm complaining about my problems all the time. To me, complaining is a mechanism of somebody maybe constantly talking about their issues, but not having any interest in addressing the problem solving behind it, right? When most people are really trying to look at solutions for what it is. So I don't really see it as complaining. And obviously that's another thing to kind of clarify with family members is it really complaining? You know, and I love this too, another comment, we're called snowflakes for a reason, none of us are the same, right? So the phrase snowflake has really taken on a lot of connotation in the last couple of years. Some people see it as being overly fragile or sensitive in a bad way. I don't think fragility or sensitivity is necessarily bad. But then at the same time, we also forget that snowflakes are like fingerprints, right? No two are the same. And so every person is going to have a different reaction. I'm going to read another comment. I have found 3 cousins with sarcoidosis in the past few years. Across 3 cousins, one passed away in their early 50s. Now lots of extended family have anxiety about it. Raising awareness of sarcoidosis in extended family has a certain backlash. Across 3 countries, sorry, not just 3 cousins. And it's interesting, you know, when you think about people often will use avoidance in order to manage their anxiety, right? So let's say I got a medical bill in the mail. It was a greeting card, not a medical bill, but just, you know, hear me out. I have a medical bill. It's really high and I'd rather not address it because it makes me anxious about my financial situation. It's much better for me to just throw it away in a drawer and not think about it, right? When people are advocating for something like an illness that is across multiple family members, and something for which there is a shared trauma. So losing a family member to sarcoidosis in your early 50s is a trauma, right? And I'm so sorry for your loss. I really appreciate your sensitivity and your sharing with the team, sharing with the webinar today and the other participants. So when you have a shared trauma, not everybody's going to want to talk about it. But again, going back to, have I actually done something wrong? You didn't. You're advocating and you're empowering yourself so you can navigate the best way to manage the illness, whether it's sort of prompting people to understand the invisibility of it and navigating the emotional needs of people with sarcoidosis, or maybe it's another kind of advocacy, raising money, raising awareness of research that's out there, clinical trials. None of that is bad, right? And it always makes me kind of wonder, those other people who are creating the backlash for your advocacy, what is it that they're trying to achieve? Is it trying to manage their own anxiety? And you don't have to be your family's therapist. You don't have to dig deep and say, gosh, I wonder if your backlash has something to do with your anxiety. That's just not realistic. But is there another thing that you can sort of bring back to show them what is your desired outcome? It's not to trigger their trauma. Your awareness and your advocacy is to try to help save lives of other people, including those of your family. And who can really argue with that, right? But again, when you're advocating for yourself, when you're showing more of that advocacy across multiple groups, etc., just remember that you do not have anything to be guilty for, right? Mindy, can I get the next slide, please? To remember, you are not responsible for other people's reactivity, discomfort, disappointment, or sadness, whether it's when you set boundaries, whether it is your advocacy efforts. If I see something and it's particularly triggering or traumatic for me, for example, my mother is a breast cancer survivor. And so every October, I just see all those pink ribbons everywhere. It's gone down a little bit in the last couple of years, but it's a trigger, right? It reminds me of a time I was only 17 when she was diagnosed. It was a pretty tough time. And that being said, when other people are advocating and they are finding empowerment from showing that, is it their responsibility to manage my discomfort or is it mine? It will always be mine, right? That is something for me to take on and to manage. And I feel like I've done pretty well with it. So just remember, when you are setting these boundaries and creating these expectations for other people, to remind yourself, I'm not responsible for other people's reactions. I'm not responsible for their discomfort with my advocacy. You can certainly care about them. We're not suggesting that you be a Grinch and be cold and just, well, I don't care about them. That's not what we're saying. But you don't have to take on the emotional responsibility of their discomfort. We are only responsible for ourselves, right? Next slide, Mindy, please. So if we can just include in some more of the chat, and I know we'll get to some of this in the Q&A later, But any other questions about boundaries, or does anybody struggle with setting boundaries? Even just being able to draw the boundaries and verbalize them, or managing the reactions of other people? What do you think? The guilt piece is probably what I hear from patients the most. And I think folks have been particularly good in the chat about already giving some really excellent comments about boundary setting and what's been difficult. Oh, I love this one. So somebody wrote to Mindy saying, I struggle with wanting to be the good one. And if I set a boundary, I won't have that identity anymore. And to know that clarifying expectations has no effect on our morality or whether or not we are a good sister, a good mother, etc. If anything, it's also modeling for other people that if we are going to be setting boundaries and clarifying our own expectations of what makes us comfortable, then they can do the same as well, right? We want to, some of the people that I think I know that I'm closest with, that let's say, even if it's a Zoom call or if we're due to meet each other in person, if the other person feels uncomfortable, there is no guilt, right? And as soon as one person sets that expectation, then the other can follow. The other thing too is to navigate in your family system. What does being the good one mean to you? What is the value of that? And maybe the value of that is outdated, or if you've outgrown that particular identity, that maybe instead of identifying as this good one with other people, that maybe that's not as important to you anymore. Maybe your values have changed, and maybe previously being judged in such a positive manner with other people isn't as important as your own comfort. Had another comment, over the years, I've worked hard to make sure I always honor myself. Awesome. And we want that for other people, right? This isn't about selfishness. This isn't about, I want my boundaries, but nobody else can have boundaries, right? We want everybody else to clarify their expectations so that everybody is comfortable. So when we honor ourselves, we also give the people in our lives permission for them to honor themselves as well. I'm going to read another comment here. I have family and friends who are more dismissive or seem to try to not acknowledge the changes in me since I was diagnosed with sarcoidosis. When I set boundaries, they tried to have me resume my former self or role in their lives. And I just have to keep my ground no matter what their reaction. Excellent. Again, we are not responsible for other people's reaction. So and you can certainly validate that, right? When I was diagnosed with sarcoidosis, I really struggled with adjusting to, and I'm just saying this hypothetically, I don't have sarcoidosis myself, but I'm just saying, if you were to say this to another person, ever since I got my diagnosis, I had to really adjust and struggle with what my former self could do with what I can no longer do. And that was a really hard adjustment for me. Are you struggling with that too? Are you struggling to see me differently than my former capabilities? And again, that doesn't mean that it's okay for them to not respect your own boundary setting, but it does provide some empathy to say, we have a common ground here. We have both struggled with this. Another comment here, family won't wear a mask or get vaccinated. Also lost most friends due to my sarcoidosis. I don't know what more I can do or say. For this person, I hope that you will reach out to more of the social connections that people have with the Foundation for Sarcoidosis Research. We want you to be connected with people who are going to support you through this. And I think that unfortunately, in the last couple of years, there have been a lot of values that we've all had to contend with, and what people in our lives don't have the same kinds of values that we do. So we deserve to have the kind of values consistent with the people who are in our lives. Everybody deserves that, right? And I do hope that maybe there's still a chance that some of those other people that you've lost or who don't have congruent values with you might change their mind in the future, right? We never know, but it's something that I've also, as many times as I've seen people, have really had to struggle with their friendships over the last couple of years because of the pandemic, that some of them with some really good talks have been open to it. I'm so glad Mindy just sent us a link to the virtual support group, and which is both by peers as well as people who have clinical mental health backgrounds. So yay, this is an amazing organization. That's why I keep participating with you guys. It's incredible. We have another comment, and then I'm going to move on to our next slide. My mother told me it was okay to have self-preservation, and that meant a lot to me. She was right, because we matter. So remember that even if we are talking about all the struggles with our boundaries, we hope that we at least have a couple of people, and maybe even one person in particular, who's going to be our cheerleader, who is going to understand your boundaries, who may even be a good advocate for you with other family members and friends to say, listen, this isn't because this person is doing something wrong. This is because they have an illness that they can't help. That's why they're having a struggle with this. And who knows, I've been focusing primarily on sarcoidosis as the reason for why boundaries need to be set, but that's just the tip of the iceberg. There are people with whom we have to set boundaries because their reactions or the way that they treat us is inappropriate and not effective. We'll get into more of that later. All right, I'm going to close the chat for just a little bit, and we'll keep going to the next slide, please. All right, so I don't know if anybody has heard of dialogical behavioral therapy. It's been in existence since the mid-'80s. It was primarily used for something called borderline personality disorder, but over the last couple of decades has grown in its birth of different types of mental health treatments for this particular modality. And primarily, we're looking at this from a very basic overview. There are just certain elements of the therapy that I wanted to introduce in this session, because I think it also overlaps with a lot of the things that we're talking about for boundary setting. Next slide, please. So DBT is trying to foster better emotion regulation through skill building. So a lot of the therapy types that we have are focused on talking about the way that you think. Maybe you're having a lot of low self-esteem because of the way that you have held certain beliefs about yourselves, and that continues through life. DBT is sort of like the mental equivalent of teaching you life skills. So for example, I was driving in really bad Chicago snow yesterday, and the little light came on my car that said that I had low tire pressure. And I was just thinking to myself, oh no, what if something happens and I get a flat tire? That's not a skill that I have, right? So a life skill that I would probably need is, how do I change a tire, right? When it comes to DBT, we're looking at the same thing, but we're thinking about emotion regulation. So, excuse me, if nobody ever taught me how to regulate my emotions, I can talk until I'm blue in the face about what I think or feel, but then I don't have a way to tolerate the pain that comes from talking about it. And it primarily focuses on 4 different types of skill building categories: mindfulness, distress tolerance. So when we're in a distressing situation, we can't change and we have to tolerate the pain that's coming from it. Interpersonal effectiveness, which is a lot of what we've been talking about. Interpersonal means, between multiple people. So you typically between 2 people. And how do we communicate in a way that's most effective? Something I tell my patients all the time is you can have honest communication that is not effective, but you can also have honest communication that is effective. So we're talking about interpersonal effectiveness, something that helps us communicate in the best way possible what we're actually trying to say. And then emotion regulation. So how do we change emotions that we want to change? You're kind of like what we were talking about, emotions of guilt, right? And feelings of guilt. So that's something that we can navigate. How do we navigate that guilt, right? How do we change the guilt into something else, right? And part of this comes from the idea that when we have our reasonable mind, so a very robotic, logical, this is the part of your brain that does math problems, that thinks about scientific data, all of that, the reasonable mind. or rational mind, as it's also called. And then you have the emotion mind. That's all feeling. That's all Romeo and Juliet and drama and emotion. And Dr. Linehan, who created this particular type of therapy, says that we all have something called wise mind, where the two interact, where we allow space for the emotions, but we also allow space for the thinking part of it as well, and the thoughts that come from it. And so that's what we actually want to try to address when we're thinking about how do we manage our holiday wellness. We want to be able to have the positive and even the negative emotional experiences integrated with our more logical and our more practical way of thinking about things. And so we're looking for that wisdom piece that's in the middle. Whenever I think about this, I think that we can all think about people in our lives who present that wisdom to us. And when you think about that wisdom, these are the people who kind of have those two things integrated. They're not overly emotional, but they're also not overly robotic or cold either. They usually have some kind of synthesis between the two. They're rational, they're logical, and they talk about things in a very practical manner, but then they also have a attunement to their emotional needs as well. And that's where I think wisdom comes in the middle. Next slide, please. So this is coming from the emotion regulation piece of DBT. And please, there's a lot of mnemonics in DBT. And so you'll see that a lot of this is talking about physical illness and eating and avoiding mood altering drugs. This is talking about getting enough sleep, exercise, and building mastery for all of it. So all of the acronyms that are here are basically talking about what are the circumstances for how do we help our body get us to a place where our emotions are less likely to be a huge roller coaster. So, for example, if you're hungry, you are not going to be emotionally regulated. That's where the phrase hangry comes from, right? So, and please know, when I talk about all of these things, I'm trying to come at it from a non-ableist perspective. So when I talk about exercise, I'm not talking about running marathons. I'm talking about doing something that feels comfortable for your body, given the symptoms that you're experiencing. Maybe it's very light stretching. Maybe it's a little bit of walking, whatever feels comfortable, especially based on what your doctor has suggested is okay. No one's going to be running marathons here, and that's okay. We don't want to be talking about that piece of it. Same thing with sleep, if you've struggled with sleep. Mood altering drugs, there's going to be a lot of alcohol probably served around the holidays, and that doesn't help us if we're already in an emotional state, right? Caffeine is another one. Caffeine has a very strong relationship to anxiety. So if you're about to sort of set some of those anxiety producing conversations about boundary setting, maybe kind of cut back on the caffeine a little bit as well. And again, so like when we talk about managing physical illness, that is both related to the sarcoidosis piece of it. So making sure that you're following up with maybe your primary care physician, whoever it is, just to make sure that you kind of get a general balance of everything that's happening. But also, again, COVID risk and what you feel comfortable doing to help prevent it, managing colds, anything that you're struggling with, and giving yourself permission to address that. Because when you feel empowered to address preventing any sort of physical ailment, and it doesn't even have to be, again, related to your sarcoidosis, it could be migraine headaches, it could be other issues that you're struggling with, diabetes, etc. When you feel empowered to address all the things on this list, you're going to feel more empowered emotionally as well, because you're going to feel a lot better, more stable, and able to communicate what those emotions are. Next slide, please. So the next couple of slides are going to be focused on, again, skills for interpersonal effectiveness. So how do I communicate in a way that is effective with communicating in a way that respects other people? I'm going to be gentle. I'm going to act interested. I'm going to validate what the other person thinks, right? Even if I don't agree with it. And I'm going to try to use an easy manner. Maybe I'll pepper in some humor in there as well. If we do the opposite, if I'm aggressive, if I'm dismissive and not interested, and I'm on my phone the whole time, if I completely invalidate the way the other person feels, and if I have a very harsh demeanor and it's very cold, I'm not going to get anywhere, am I? So this give mnemonic, and I think it's perfect for Thanksgiving, right? Is an excellent way to sort of frame, how do I make sure that I'm communicating in a way that's respectful, especially when you're communicating boundaries. And if somebody tells you that you're not being respectful, you can come back to these 4 items, because sometimes people can use this notion of being disrespectful is actually manipulative as a way to say, I don't like what you're telling me, so I'm going to put it in the category of disrespect, even if it's just disagreeing with them, right? We can disagree with people and still be respectful. It's possible. Next slide, please. This is probably the most important part of this interpersonal effectiveness. It's how do we communicate in a way that fosters self-respect for us? So even if the other person is not following that give mnemonic, they're not being respectful to us, we can still communicate with others in a way that shows my self-respect is important. So I can be fair. It's fair to me that if I have sarcoidosis, I'm going to be able to set limits because I have a chronic illness that deems it appropriate for me to attend holiday parties virtually, for me to not stay at gatherings for longer than I have to, for me to not feel like I have to overdo it. No apologies, right? One of the things that I really love is there's a lot more in social media talking about not apologizing and rather trying to find a way to thank people. So instead of so sorry I'm late, or I'm so sorry I can't stay this long, thank you for understanding. Thank you for your patience, etc. Stick to your values. Don't feel like you have to all of a sudden change what you need or what you feel in terms of like what we were talking about at the very beginning about how you value the holidays. You don't have to change any of that. That's for you. So stick to that. And then be truthful, right? It's not fair to us to have to lie, to set boundaries in such a way that we feel that other people will honor our boundaries more. Maybe over elaborating your symptoms or faking some other reason of why you can't make a certain gathering, right? You owe it to yourself to be truthful while you communicate the boundaries to others in a way that's effective. If other people can't handle the truth, that's on them. Going back to what we said before, that it's not your responsibility to manage other people's discomfort. Next slide, please. So we're going to get into a little bit of positive psychology here. Just for the sake of time, I'm going to breeze through these a little bit, but I think that it's important that while we talk about all these things that are kind of negative and stressful about the holiday season, that we also slow down enough and look at a conceptual model that helps us figure out how do we retain more of those positive experiences. Next slide, please. What is savoring, right? So we kind of might know what savoring means to us on a more colloquial level, but savoring is an actual studied positive psychology concept created by Fred Bryant and Joseph Burnoff. And it's a conceptual model of how to frame positive experiences in life. So you can have different experiences that are positive, but they're positive for different reasons, right? The positivity that I feel when I see a beautiful sunrise is going to be different than the positivity that I see when my son takes his first steps, right? So I think it can be really fun to kind of explore what is savoring and how do I incorporate different elements of that savoring into my life. Next slide, please. Let's start with the first one, luxuriating. This is about extending feelings of pleasure. I'm going to take a few extra minutes in bed with my morning coffee or tea in this case, and just relax. I'm going to breathe in the scent of laundry that I just took out of the dryer. And, usually I take the morning paper or my book in the morning and I only breeze through it. Maybe I'll read for maybe 5-10 minutes. I'm going to extend that. So this is about existing pleasures in your life and maximizing them as much as possible. Maybe you sit in the bubble bath a little bit longer or in the shower or whatever it is, right? This is about luxuriating. And most of this, I would say, is a sensory thing, if ever possible. So anything of the 5 senses, whether it's something that you are eating, something that you are smelling, something you're touching, right? So if there's something that provides a lot of physical touch that you really like from a sensory level, then you keep doing it. Next slide, please. Marveling, just sort of that, oh, wow situation. I think it's so wonderful if we can just take a few moments to observe beauty, or to just sort of marvel at something particular that, again, sits with your values, sits with something that you really find to be attractive or beautiful. My son, the other day, Halloween in my area, at least, we had a double rainbow. So it was one of those weird days. Typically, it's very cold in our area for Halloween at the end of October. It was maybe 60 degrees, beautiful fall day. It had been raining most of the day, and then we see this double rainbow. And my son just goes, "It's so beautiful." That's marveling, right? And it catches you off guard. And sometimes it's just something that's really pretty. Next, please. Basking. This is all about pride. This is about the warm fuzzies that you get when you're recognized for something, or when you're seeing major achievements or even small achievements. So this is my son completing a puzzle. He was just delighted. This kid is a savoring guru already, and he's only 3. So whatever it is, and it can be pride for yourself, it could be pride for somebody else, your favorite sports team, doesn't matter. Enjoy the basking. Next, please. Thanksgiving is not just one day. Thanksgiving is every day, expanding on our feelings of gratitude. I like to keep several boxes of thank you cards for myself, just to have on hand for maybe a good experience I had at a restaurant, or for gift giving or gift receiving, I should say. If somebody has given me something, then I can give them a note back. It's just a way to sort of expand on that warm, gushy feeling when you feel gratitude for yourself. There's so much, just even on gratitude alone, so much research that has been done that helps to support this. And again, it's just sort of making sure, how do we incorporate gratitude other than on just Thanksgiving? Great that we have a day that is dedicated to it. I think that's probably why it's my favorite holiday. It's very positive and uplifting, or at least it's supposed to be, right? But we don't have to just limit it to one day. 365 days a year. How can we incorporate gratitude into our practice? Next, please. So there's different ways to help us savor more. I think that many times, especially in our culture, we equate positivity and enjoying things, it can feel selfish or indulgent. So as long as we kind of dismiss that, we recognize that it's actually helpful. So positive psychology research shows that if we focus on more of these positive things without being fake about it, this is not inventing things to be happy about. These are things that are supposed to sort of come from you naturally and generally. And so we want to incorporate that, but then we don't want it to seem selfish because it helps you manage, some of the other negative things that may be happening in your life. We want to engage all of the senses. So what does this particular moment look like? If I'm looking at something, I'm looking at a sunset or a sunrise, I'm in the forest, I'm seeing the sun trickling through the trees, or a beautiful piece of artwork at a museum. What does something sound like? Maybe I'm appreciating and luxuriating in hearing rainfall on a summer night or thunderstorms. What does it smell like? I'm going to just enjoy. And again, luxuriating is a fun one, I think, for the senses, a fresh candle that smells good, a warm bath or shower that feels good. What does something taste like, right? That first taste of birthday cake, or for me, it's going to be pumpkin pie next Thursday. I'm going to savor that so much. And I like to think of this as a more positive form of mindfulness. So mindfulness is more neutral. You're just observing your thoughts. You're watching them go by to try to stay present in the moment. This is kind of like kicked up a notch. So not only are we going to be present in the moment, in this one moment, I'm going to appreciate from all 4 of those different perspectives this particular moment. And then just giving yourself the time you need to experience the moment fully and take pause. Next slide, please. Perfect. So, we don't have to necessarily go through this question because I want to get to some of the questions that Mindy had from the Eventbrite, but just looking at, for yourself, you can think about your favorite ways to savor. For some of you, you're already going to be natural gratitude people like me. You're going to have a gratitude journal on your nightstand. That's already going to be something that you think about. Or maybe you are that basking grandma. You are like, I just love to see all of my grandkids and what they're up to. And I get so proud of them. I go to their band concerts and I want to see their football games. Maybe that's your thing. Or marveling. You're that person who will be in a group of people and you'll just say, isn't it a beautiful day out today? You're marveling at the nice, all of it. So just give yourself permission to think about your favorite ways to savor. Next, please. So I want to thank you all for having me today. I want to give some time. I know maybe just in the next couple of minutes, Mindy, if there are any of those questions that we got from Eventbrite that really just stood out to you that we can cover, and then any other remaining questions.
Yeah, thank you, Sandra, for that great presentation. We are basically out of time, but I did want to give one question that we didn't really talk about. We did talk a lot about having family. And so we did get a couple people in the Eventbrite who mentioned that their greatest challenge with the holidays is actually not having family.
Okay.
And so I'm not sure if you have any suggestions for that.
Definitely. So many of, I have a patient recently who said, and this is not because she actually doesn't have family, it's rather that her family is so dysfunctional to the point that she knows she has to remove herself away from them. And so one of the things that she said is she found that she was always reflecting on that Hallmark moment. She kept thinking that, well, the movies say I have to have family. The movies say that I have to have this in order to have a good holiday. And let's just put all of that aside for now. And we can still honor the negative emotions that come from that. Maybe it's loneliness, maybe it's family that we're missing and we're grieving them and we're sad because they're not with us anymore, or any of those other things, right? But to know that family is not the only ingredient necessary to have a good holiday, right? Just like if you're baking, you're cooking and you realize, oh, I forgot this particular ingredient. I don't have baking soda. I don't have eggs. What can I do? You can alter the recipe. So when you're thinking about your holiday, if family's not a part of it, make it a different recipe. Change it. Adjust for something else. Do you fill it in with friends or neighbors instead? Do you fill it in with a day for yourself? And doing something that makes you feel more like you.
Great. Thank you so much, Sandra. And thank you for everybody attending. And this is such a great webinar. We love having you. We really appreciate you coming. Folks who are still on the call, if you are using a browser, you'll automatically be redirected to our survey. We really do appreciate your feedback with every one of these. It really does help us make decisions about future programming, and we'll be excited to talk to Sandra about the next webinar that we can get her to come and do. But I really do hope everyone has a wonderful holiday and enjoys the rest of their weekend. And once again, Sandra, thank you so much for this. It was fabulous as always.
Thank you. And thank you all. The Thanksgiving part of the savoring, I'm so grateful that you all took the time and just to be vulnerable and talking about so many of these different issues and hearing me ramble on. I promise I do have some thought that goes into it. I just tend to talk a lot when I get nervous. So
it was great. Thank you so much.
Thank you guys. We appreciate it. Have a wonderful, wonderful holiday.
Bye. Thank
Bye.
you.